Thanks very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I love India, but I've never been to Gujarat before, so I'm very much looking forward to my stay once I've got rid of the jet lag. So, as was said in that very kind introduction, my main interest for a number of years has been this remarkable period of geological time in which the first animals appear. The first animals evolve. But one of the other surprising aspects, perhaps, is that all of those body plans of animals that we take for granted, if we look on the TV at a natural history program, or if we go down to a beach and we see fish with a plane of bilateral symmetry and an eye on either side of the head, and ears, at least rudimentary ears, hearing capsules on either side of the head, or if we see a starfish with 5 rays, or a sea urchin, also with 5 rays, but a different shape of body. All of those body plans first appeared in the Cambrian Explosion 540 million years ago, give or take. And the interesting thing is that really very few new body plans have appeared since. So it's not just that animals evolved for the first time, it's that that basic architecture of animals is established. And once it's established, that's what we have for the next 500 million years. So that's been a focus for biologists and geologists for a number of years. And one of my angles of research is trying to understand marine environments and sedimentary environments, and to look at how the sedimentary environment might perhaps have influenced this remarkable event called the Cambrian Explosion. So what I want to do is look a little bit further back and lead our way in. What was happening before the Cambrian Explosion? Well, you might be able to make a rough guess that it was something called Snowball Earth, so we'll talk about that first, and then we'll move into the story about the Cambrian Explosion itself. So I shall try and avoid, we've just been talking I've been talking with some of the faculty about the way that geologists take for granted geological time in the way that astronomers take for granted distances and light years. So, you know, for us, 1 million or 10 million years is the twinkling of an eye. So forgive me if I slip into geological speak, but we're dealing with periods of tens of millions of years for this event, something like that. So geologically instantaneous, as we say. Let's start here with that modern marine ecosystem that I hinted at. So, you know, we're all familiar with this sort of photograph, these sorts of video images from David Attenborough programs or National Geographic programs on the TV. And we take it for granted that this is what oceans look like in terms of their biology, that this is the structure of an ocean. So we have, sorry, spoiler. Try and find which is the laser on here? I've got it. This is a primary producer, so it's taking in sunlight. It's a coral, it's taking in sunlight and it's fixing sunlight and turning it into organic matter. We then go up through a whole series of primary consumers, secondary consumers, up to apex predators, and there'll be bigger apex predators than this, sharks and so on. And so that sort of food web, food chain, is something that we take for granted in modern ecosystems. But actually, if we go back to the Precambrian, this is a pretty good photograph of a Precambrian ecosystem. Life probably evolved about 3.8 billion years ago. And for the first 3 billion years, this is what the ocean seafloor looked like. It's a cyanobacterial mat, so a sheet of bacteria. You might just be able to see in this top corner what's coming out as gray is actually a sort of bluey green. Sometimes they're called the blue-green bacteria. They're photosynthesizing. They're generating oxygen bubbles as a product of that photosynthesis. Those oxygen bubbles are pressing up against the underside of this mat of bacteria, a biofilm, in places where wind or current action has swept across the sediment-water interface. We're getting the mat ripped up and transported and redeposited. We can see places where the mat is beginning to decompose and bigger gas bubbles of methane are pressing up underneath it. So that is it. A few single-celled bacteria and a few products of their life and death, and very little else. You might ask how I've taken a picture of a Precambrian seafloor. Go to any long-lived puddle or small pool. This is actually in the English Lake District. It's a 6-inch deep pool that's on a track that's been there for a few months. And it's an exact replica of a Precambrian seafloor. So somehow we've got to get from that to what we saw in the slide before. And that's what, in a nutshell, this talk is about. The interim is this. This is the Cambrian explosion at the point that life evolved. It's quite a well-known reconstruction. And we've got all of those different food web relationships that I talked about in the modern reef ecosystem slide. So we do have primary producers. We've got those bacterial mats. We've got things feeding on the bacterial mats. We've got things feeding on the things that feed on the bacterial mats. And we've got apex predators feeding on those. In other words, these organisms look really different, but actually their ecology, their ecosystem structure is just the same as a modern reef. So the Cambrian explosion isn't just the evolution of animals. It's not just the emergence of the different body plans. It's also the emergence of modern ecosystems for the first time in Earth's history. So you might expect that with all of those different aspects, this is something that scientists will pay a lot of attention to, and they certainly have. On a previous trip like this, I was lying awake, jet-lagged in Hong Kong, and thought I would just go through all of the Web of Science references to the Cambrian explosion from 2000 onwards and list the different hypotheses that people have proposed for the Cambrian explosion. There are obvious ones: sea level rise, salinity decline, methane outgassing. There are less obvious ones: calcium supply. What's that got to do with anything? Evolution of consciousness. That might post-date the origin of animals rather than predate it. I like the fact that evolution might have been the cause of the Cambrian explosion. That's probably missing the question somewhat. But there's a deeper pattern to this. The first thing to point out is that you'll see that each of these is a single hypothesis for the Cambrian explosion. So it's either sea level rise, or it's light availability, or it's deep ocean oxygenation, or it's cosmic ray bombardment. The second pattern becomes clearer if I color code that list according to disciplinary background. So red are now geological hypotheses, blue are geochemical hypotheses, and green are biological hypotheses. And the thing is that biologists only propose biological hypotheses, geologists only propose geological hypotheses, and geochemists only geochemical hypotheses. So all of those hypotheses come very much from single disciplines. And actually, I think part of the debate over the Cambrian explosion, and actually why it's interesting to give this talk to such an interdisciplinary audience as this IIT represents, is that I think there's been a lack of focus on what's happening at the interdisciplinary boundaries. And actually, might more than one of these be true? And might we be looking at a more complex scenario than simply one hypothesis explaining everything? We'll come back to that right at the end. So this is the period of geological time that we're talking about. I'm going to start off talking about the Cryogenian. This is the sort of run-up to the Cambrian Explosion. The Cambrian Explosion itself is up here, so that's quite a run-up, even by geological terms. Over 150 million years is enough warming up for an event to happen. And there are important parts of the story that we need to understand in these periods of geological time, relatively newly named, called the Cryogenian and the Ediacaran. And one of the things we need to talk first about to understand the context is the fact that there are some major episodes of glaciation across the Earth. One from about 720 to 660, the Sturtian. Another from about 650 to 635 called the Marinoan, both named after Australian localities. And a third, more minor and slightly younger glaciation called the Gasquias, named after a place in Newfoundland at 580. And the thing about these is that these aren't glaciations like we have at present. We take it for granted that we've got ice at the North Pole, ice at the South Pole. We take it for granted that during the Quaternary period, those polar ice caps expanded into what are now temperate latitudes. That's straightforward. What we're talking about with these are glacial episodes in which the ice expansion occurred until the expansion from the North Pole and the expansion from the South Pole met at the equator to form so-called Snowball Earth events. Let's have a look at that. And the field area that I'm going to mainly focus on, because it's where I love going, and it's got fantastic exposure of rocks, is Greenland. And I'm going to talk about these Snowball Earth events from the perspective of northeast Greenland, and in particular, this locality, Kongoska Fjord, at about 73 degrees north. So the Arctic Circle runs through here, so we're a good way north of the Arctic Circle, so it's summer activity only. And this is the pattern of rocks that we get immediately prior to that Snowball Earth event. So these are reefs made of those cyanobacteria, those blue-green bacteria that I talked about a moment ago. In the absence of any other reef builders like corals, they could make reefs. Perfectly good, if slightly small. This is a meter thick, so this reef is about 5 meters across and a meter and a bit high, but in a chain, a continuous chain. And in the background, this buff-colored cliff is the first glacial deposit of Snowball Earth. So somewhere between that yellow stick and that cliff in the background, we went from an environment that is one of a tropical reef. So this limestone with the reef would have been deposited in a similar environment to the modern Bahamas or the Caribbean. And yet it's overlain directly by glacial deposits. This is just to show you that these are cross-sections through these biofilms. This is a close-up of the reef, a structure we call a stromatolite, very characteristic of Precambrian marine systems. And then they're overlain by these, which anyone who's looked at modern glacial deposits would instantly recognize as a glacial till. It's transporting exotic blocks. This is a granite, this is a limestone, this is a sandstone, more granites. And it's mixing them all up, it's rounding them off, and it's depositing them floating in a matrix of mud. A classical, technically what we call a diamictite, but a tillite deposited from glacial action. And if we draw a cross-section through the area, this is a paper that I've got coming out in Precambrian Geology in the next few weeks, we've got this limestone system, this Caribbean Bahamas limestone system that's capped by glacial till. And the one thing that we know is that that transition is abrupt in geological terms. So in the space of a few tens of thousands of years, we went from Bahamas to deep freeze, to really deep freeze. And by deep freeze, we mean something like this. This is a reconstruction of the Earth in the younger of those two Snowball Earth events at 635. An almost complete snowball with just a bit of open water in the oceans around the equator. If it looks familiar, it might look familiar because it looks a bit like this. This is Enceladus, which is a moon of Saturn. Almost certainly exactly the same thing. And it's in deep freeze. It's liquid, but the liquid is methane, but the liquid is completely frozen. And one of the things that's difficult when you get to this stage with planetary freeze is that it's really difficult to unfreeze, actually, because all of the sunlight that's coming in and providing the heating is bouncing off the ice because of the albedo effect. Now, the advantage that Earth has, that Enceladus doesn't, is that we've got plate tectonics and volcanic systems that are producing new crust at the mid-ocean ridges. And eventually, over time, we think that enough heat was generated that it was sufficient to counter the snowball effect and introduce melting. The melting, once it took off, was a cascade of dramatic events. The melting really was rapid by any standards, and the tops of these glacial beds are dramatic. Now, one of the things that does, because the melting is so dramatic, is that it really perturbs, it really stirs up the oceans. And so that's the first bit of evidence that we get, that one of the consequences of melting out of a snowball Earth is that we stir up the oceans, and it seems very likely, we've got good evidence, which I'll show you in a minute, that we introduce oxygen into the oceans. And so one of those hypotheses, back on that slide a moment ago, was oxygenation of oceans. And that results from the stirring that goes on as we introduce the melting of snowball events. There's one other bit of context I need to give you, which is that although the first definite animals don't appear until here, just after this last glaciation, the gas gears, we do begin to get multicellular organisms that are much debated. They look like this. This is a wave-washed slab in Newfoundland, and they're called the Ediacaran Biota. They give their name to the geological time period. They're a series of fronds, fern-like structures, some of which are attached by these suckers, these holdfasts to the sediment. There are other shapes. Some of them occur without the stems at the base, so that they're just like the fronds. Others of them are more finely divided rather than wrinkled. Huge debate as to what they are. We can be fairly sure that in 3 dimensions they looked like this. That's a reasonably accurate reconstruction, we think. What they were biologically is still the subject of debate. Some of them, we are pretty sure, were primitive animals, these jellyfish-like things. Others, we simply don't know what they were. People have thought that they might be fungi, that they might be primitive animals, that they might be interactions like liverworts of different groups of organisms. And others like these have been reconstructed as primitive animals, and probably are very primitive animals. So there's a hint that something's coming, but nothing like the diversity that we would expect on planet Earth in terms of the animal kingdom. So let's now, having looked at that previous history, let's just have a look at the different ways of showing that something's going on in the Cambrian explosion above and beyond simply saying that animals appear. Maybe there's something a bit more sophisticated we can do than that. And people have looked at it from all sorts of different angles. So this is the one that I've focused on so far. It's the fact that all of a sudden animals appear. EB is the Ediacaran Biota, those organisms I've just shown you, and we're now going to rule them out for the rest of the talk. But at the base of the Cambrian, we get this sudden appearance. So phyla are the largest division of animal life. So we belong to the phylum Chordata as members of the class Vertebrata. So phylums are the highest level of body organization, classes one level down. So a starfish that we talked about earlier would be a member of the Astrozoa, the class Astrozoa starfish of the phylum Echinodermata. But one of the things that we see at the base of the Cambrian is that both at the phylum and the class level of body organization, we get a sudden increase. That by the middle of, well, let's say the middle of the Cambrian, we're up to 120, and that for the remainder of geological time, for the next 500 million years, having got to 120, we perhaps add another 25. So there's this huge burst of what we call disparity, of biological, anatomical variation. So that's one thing to explain and one way of defining the Cambrian explosion. This is a willfully complex diagram drawn by some authors who should have known better. It's an evolutionary tree of all of the different classes. And all it is that histogram that I've just shown you tilted on its side. So this is the number of phyla, this is the number of classes. What the colored circles are the estimated branching times of those different evolutionary events, of the separation of those different classes. And what you'll see is that the majority of them are within the Cambrian. A few are predicted to be within the late part of the Precambrian. That's okay. We've got the evidence for that in the Ediacaran fauna, but it confirms that we really do have a real biological event at the base of the Cambrian. Another way of looking at it is in terms of those ecological systems. And we go from these very simple ecological systems where even if we accept that some of the Ediacarans are animals, we don't see much evidence of food webs, of modern food webs. So we go from cyanobacterial mats with these ferns growing on them and these organisms perhaps slithering over them, to the Cambrian ecosystem, which is dramatically different. It has a full range of predator-prey interactions on the seabed, on the sediment-water interface, as we call it more technically. But two other things leap out at this slide, one of them trying to do so almost literally. Rather than always hugging the sediment surface, animals have exploited two new habitats. One of them is burrowing. So for the first time, we begin to get extensive burrowing of sediments by things we can call generally worms. That has a major engineering effect on the Earth system, because what you're doing is you're squirting oxygen down those burrows, sucking oxygen down those burrows, and oxygenating a whole new habitat that organisms can invade and thrive in. So that predator-prey relationship extends down into the substrate. It then goes up into the water column as well, because simultaneously, organisms develop the ability to swim. Floaters come first, then swimmers, then predatory swimmers. And all of a sudden, we've got that complex food web within the water column, as well as on the seabed, as well as under the seabed. What that does is really increase the amount of ecological space we have. And one of the things we know from ecological experiments, a classic one in the 1950s, where they took a mangrove island, counted the species diversity of the mangrove island, and then cut it in half, towed half off, let the species diversity settle down, cut it in half again, and do all the counting over a very long period of time, is that species diversity is related to habitable area. It's a really important principle of biological conservation. So if we're increasing the amount of habitable volume into the water column, down into the sediment, we should expect that species diversity will really, really increase. So maybe that's a driver for the Cambrian explosion. Just as a quick aside, there's probably not much difference between being able to swim up into the water column and burrow down into the substrate. It's the same principle. And as those of you who've got water bottles swig water, it's that action, actually. It's peristaltic motion. It's that circular contraction of muscles squeezing water down your esophagus that enables both burrowing organisms to burrow and swimming organisms to swim. So actually, they're probably linked by the evolution of peristaltic motion. The other way of looking at it, and this is another evolutionary tree, but color-coded in a different way, are all these different animal groups color-coded according to the minerals that they use to make their skeletons. So in blue, we've got calcium carbonate. These are the organisms that use calcite, or one of its relatives, to make their, so clams, echinoderms, starfish, all those. So the majority of organisms use calcium carbonate. A few, including us, use calcium phosphate. So our bones are made of calcium phosphate, the mineral apatite, and that is used in brachiopods, Chaetonaths, some very obscure groups here, and us, the chordates. And then a very small number of organisms, really small number, in terms of animals, really only the sponges, use silica, quartz sand, basically. There are two important take-home messages from this, three maybe. The first is that all of this mineralization appears at the same time at the base of the Cambrian. It's what Darwin used to define the base of the Cambrian, the origin of animal life. Once an organism has picked its mineral, in evolutionary terms, it sticks with it. So back at the base of the Cambrian, we as a group, in evolutionary terms, chose phosphate, and we've used phosphate ever since. Only a very small number of groups try one thing and in evolutionary terms say, nah, that's not very good, actually, we'll try the other one. Brachiopods are an example that swap over, but not many others do. Arthropods would be another. And then the final take-home message from this is that you think, okay, so these things are growing skeletal hard parts. Now, we use, as vertebrates, skeletal hard parts in two ways. So if you think of a tortoise or a turtle, it's using those skeletal hard parts as defense, as armor. If you think of a tiger or a lion or us, we're using those skeletal hard parts for predation, as teeth. So which comes first, the predation or the defense? Actually, they appear at exactly the same moment. It's an evolutionary arms race. The moment one develops sophisticated teeth, the next has got to evolve sophisticated armor. Is probably the way around it happens. But they appear at the same time. And so we get teeth and shells occurring in the same bed, virtually. Not dwell on this one, but the other way of defining it is that we suddenly get the appearance of modern food webs. Trace fossils are the remains of fossils that are identified only by their tracks and trails, so burrows, footprints, things like that. So the fact that there's a sudden increase in the different types of trace fossils tells us that this is the onset of burrowing. So it's confirmation of that. We can look at geochemically at oxygen levels in the sediment, and that confirms that these burrows are introducing oxygen. We can look at oxygen over a larger time scale, and this comes back to Snowball Earth. So these are the Snowball Earth events. And it shows us that we get surface water oxygenation throughout the Precambrian, but we get deep water oxygenation only after the last of those glacial events. So there is something about oxygenating the oceans. Probably not to very high levels. Even in modern oceans, we don't have very high oxygen levels. So if you were my students, I would ask you what the oxygen levels in the oceans are. But they're between 1% and 2%. Tiny amounts of oxygen. So we're not talking about huge amounts of oxygen being pumped in, but just a little bit. And finally, one of the things that we see that's only recently been recognized, and it's still being confirmed, is that we seem to get a sudden increase in calcium in seawater. What's the significance of calcium in seawater? Well, calcium is a cell toxin. If you put calcium salts into virtually any culture, any live culture, those cells will die. So the instant act of a cell is to try and get any calcium outside the cell. So the instinct of that cell is going to be to combine it with some other ion to produce a compound that can be expelled from the cell. So what happens experimentally as a thought experiment if we increase the levels of calcium? Cells are trying to expel it to anything that that calcium will bond with, and the more abundant ions of choice would be carbonate, so you produce calcite, or phosphate, so you produce apatite. So maybe the onset of biomineralization is actually a response to increased calcium levels, and cells are reacting by, in evolutionary terms, pushing the calcium out. It's not constrained by great data, let's put it that way. I would tell my students off normally if they drew a straight line between two data points, but there does seem to be an increase at least. And people are really focusing hard on trying to confirm it. So let's look at the fossils themselves. They're not common, these localities where we can really dig into the Cambrian Explosion. There are three classic ones. The Burgess Shale, that some of you might have heard about in British Columbia in Canada. Chengjiang, which is now in South China. And the one we're going to focus on, because it's where I've done most of my research, Sirius Passet, right up on the north coast of Greenland. 3 data points, but they all cluster around the equator. And actually, we've added more data points since then of less spectacular deposits. There is something about the clustering of these points around the equator. So there might be something around the fact that the Cambrian Explosion was an equatorial event, that it's enabled by warm weather, or warm water. So let me just tell you a little bit about this area that we're getting the evidence from. This is it. This is the view from the field site, looking across the fjord. That's actually about 20 kilometers. The scale is deceptive. And looking out to the Arctic Ocean in the top photograph. In terms of location, Greenland is here, the UK is here, and Sirius Passet is there, just about the northernmost land it's possible to walk on. So that's part of the attraction for going and working on rocks there. If we zoom in a bit, it's just on this bend in a very typical fjord, and we'll talk geologically about the significance of that bend in a moment. And it was found in the 80s. I was on the expedition, but working elsewhere in North Greenland when it was found. It's still only been visited perhaps 6 times, and that's because it is fiendishly remote and difficult to get to. It requires very extended logistics. I was lucky enough to be on the first expedition that went in to collect, and it was probably the interesting expedition I've been on, in that because of the way we got in, there was no logistics to get into the field site. So we had to get a plane to land on the tundra on an unprepared strip and simply drop us off in the middle of nowhere in the hope that we'd be able to build a landing strip for the plane to come back and pick us up. At the moment they dropped us off, we had no way of getting home from North Greenland. The nearest people to this locality are maybe 500 kilometers away, and that's a little weather station. The nearest village is 2,000 kilometers away. It's remote. So this is the plane taking off and leaving us in the middle of nowhere. The first problem was that we weren't at the actual locality. We were actually about 10 kilometers from where we wanted to be. So we then had to carry a ton of equipment 10 kilometers across the high Arctic. And we thought of this and built some makeshift trolleys that we could transport by plane. So the next few days were spent tugging a ton of equipment across the landscape. And the first problem we came across was this river, which was pretty deep, fast, and substantial. So that was the less pleasant part of the expedition. We did this for 8 hours non-stop, just taking equipment backwards and forwards. I was young and strong in those days. And then we had to find the locality from a very rudimentary description, but we did. And it's now there as one of the best sites, if one of the most remote sites for studying the Cambrian Explosion. There was then the small matter of building the runway. So the days were spent doing the geology in the field. The nights were spent literally digging a runway. But fortunately, that's provided the infrastructure for going back in. And now it's much easier. There's a whole 200 meters of landing strip for the plane to land on. And that's all that these particular planes take. The approach is still hairy. There's no air traffic control in Greenland. So the runway is difficult to spot from the air, ironically. It's only marked by a few orange stones. And normally it involves one of the geologists lying on top of the equipment, guiding the pilots in to find this 200 meters of runway. It's fun. And that's what the runway looks like. This is the beginning, and that's the end of the runway. We can just about take 1 ton in and 1 ton out. So everything we eat can be taken out as fossils, basically. So there's an incentive to eat as much as we can as well. In camp, idyllic, except for the mosquitoes. And then you remember that all of a sudden you're at 83 degrees north and you're not far from the North Pole. So it's a mixture of weather. T-shirts to full Everest-style down jackets, I would say. And this is the locality itself. It's a scree that we've started quarrying into, and then it's a matter of carrying the stuff 5 kilometers down the hill, bagging it up, ready to go in the plane on the way home. Typically, we just go up with 6 people, something like that. Anything else, anything more than 1 plane load, the logistics just gets too extended. So a bit of simple geology. We don't need to focus on Greenland particularly, but this is just to say that you tend to think, if you think of Greenland at all, as this icy continent. It is that, of course. It's got some of the thickest ice sheets on the planet. But around the edges is a geological paradise of land from which ice has recently retreated, leaving bare rock from one end to the other. And these are big land areas. So the North Greenland area of bare rock that we're talking about is about the size of France. These are, substantial land areas which we can explore. In geological terms, we are the localities right at the edge of the continental shelf. So the continental shelf is where the continental craton, the old rocks, extend and then begin to dip off, slope down into the deep oceans. And that's the boundary between pale blue and dark blue on here. And that's pretty much where we are in our locality. Actually, in detail, that's exactly where we are. This is our geological map. And pale green is the deep water. The bluish color is the shallow water. The dark green is intermediate between deep and shallow. And our locality is just here, right exactly where we'd expect. So we're in a few hundred meters of water depth, probably, just as shallow water with light coming in dips off into the dark, deep ocean. That probably has something to do with it. Geological cross-section that, if you're not a geologist, will not make a huge amount of sense, but we're in this dark green color, and it tells you what I've just said. These are the shallow water deposits going off into deep ocean, and our locality is just in here. So what animals do we find at Sirius Passet? Well, this is one of the typical ones. This is an organism called a trilobite. They're arthropods, primitive arthropods, most closely related to crustaceans. They normally have mineralized carapaces, but ours are a particular type of primitive trilobite that lacks that external mineralized body armor. They just have a less mineralized coating. So they wouldn't normally be preserved in the fossil record. So this is the first sign we've got something special. We're not just preserving shells, we're preserving muscles, we're preserving guts, we're preserving limbs, we're preserving antennae. We've got not total, but we've got much more complete biological knowledge than we would normally have. This notebook's about 20 centimeters to give you a scale. This is probably the most common fossil we find. The fossils, as you can see, are not exactly photogenic. So for the most part, in showing you what animals live there, I'm going to show you reconstructions because it's easier on the eye and easier to explain in a talk like this. So they are all well supported by the fossil evidence, but let's have a look at them. This is a thing called Halkieria. It's one of the first, most primitive mollusks. This thing, Anomalocaris, is, you've seen a few times actually, it was that apex predator I mentioned in one of the early slides. One of the first signs that we've got a complex Cambrian food chain. So finding that meant that we were pretty sure that we were dealing with real Cambrian explosion complexity, even though we were low in the Cambrian. So these rocks are about 530 million years, something like that. The base of the Cambrian is 540. So this is the oldest evidence we have for fossils just above the base of the Cambrian and our first really good window on the complexity of animal life at that point. We get these strange things that are most closely related to things called peripatus that occur in rainforest at the modern day. They're called lobopods. They're very primitive arthropods, really. Modern ones are terrestrial, but these are marine. They're predators, for the most part, and there's a fair diversity of them. In a way, they're the most characteristic fossils of the Sirius Passet locality. This is a reconstruction that we've got coming out in Nature in the next couple of weeks of a thing called Cryogenian. Free swimming, back to that swimming idea, and capturing its prey in mid-water column. They weren't all predators, though, these anomalocarids. Some of them were filter feeders, and they fed, surprisingly perhaps, just like modern whales. So just like a blue whale will use filter feeding in its mouth to filter out plankton, so these things were wafting their frontal appendages to sieve and catch microscopic food particles. So these were the baleen whales of the Cambrian, a few meters long, quite sizable by Cambrian standards, and not apex predators, but probably the largest animals, certainly, that we've got evidence for. And then, this wouldn't be the Cambrian unless we had weird things. So this is, it doesn't matter what the name is, it's called Cyrillorica. It actually looks almost identical to its living counterpart. This is its living counterpart down here. The scale bar here is, and here as well, is 25 microns long, 25 thousandths of a millimeter. This organism is tiny. Anatomically, it's identical to its Precambrian forebear, except that the Precambrian one is 20 centimeters long. It's huge. So this is an example of a phylum that's miniaturized itself. It's turned itself into a nanobot over geological time since it first evolved. There are then these funny things called vetulicolians. Lots of debate over what they are. The best hypothesis seems to be, and it's one that I've put forward with co-authors, that they're probably the most primitive fossil members of our own group. They're chordates, or at least they're the ancestors of chordates, but also of echinoderms, starfish, to which we're very closely related. So we think that these strange swimming organisms that filter fed with sucking water in through this large open mouth and pushing it out through gills here, here, and here, taking the water out as they went through, taking the food out as the water went through the gills, sat in evolutionary terms at the base of this tree that we belong to. And this is how we reconstruct them. Basically, large swimming bags with tails. The orange strips are to indicate the cilia that we're doing the filter feeding, the little hairs that in modern filter feeding groups often create a little bit of bioluminescence, or in this case, a bit of artistic license. So what about those physical and chemical conditions that I said were part of my interest? This is what work at the Sirius Passet locality is like. And it's a matter of just hard convict labor, really, of digging and quarrying for 8 or 10 hours a day, 24 hours daylight, of course. The sediments are simply very fine-grained muds and silts that have been lithified into rock. But within them, we get two distinctive occurrences of the organisms. We get one group that are pretty sure that we're living on those cyanobacterial mats, those bacterial mats. And these include the primitive mollusks, the Halkieria that I showed you, the unmineralized arthropods, some worms, some polychaete worms, some sponges, and various burrowing organisms that are attracted to anything dead. So the moment we have a carcass, it seems that worms came in and exploited that nutrient resource because there probably wasn't much nutrients in the environment. So wherever there was nutrient, those organisms moved in to exploit it. This is just a close-up of them. We've got some evidence, this particularly distinctive branching pattern, that whatever was doing this burrowing was also farming. This is 540 million-year-old farming, because these burrows are almost identical to modern burrows in which the organisms, typically arthropods, typically crustaceans, are farming bacteria. They're breeding bacteria within these galleries so that the bacteria can metabolize the sediments and they can then feast on the bacteria. So it's active farming. But then there's another group of organisms that seem to represent different niches, different ecological niches, that are interbedded. And they're typically within slightly coarser grained sediments that are overlying the microbial mats. And these include the swimming anomalocarids, swimming polychaete worms, our vetulicolians that were swimming, but also some of the burrowers. And what we think is that these things are being transported in dilute density flows. In terms of the setting, we've already said that these sediments were being deposited right on the outside of the continental shelf, just above the slope into deep ocean water. These are the rocks that underlie the Buin Formation, the rocks that we're interested in. This is our quarry, just here. Close-up of our quarry shows that the rocks are aging in different directions. So this must be a geological fault. This can't be the original relationship. But we do see that relationship around the corner. This is how it's been reconstructed, that a bit like the modern Bahamas, there was a continental shelf, then a cliff, and then the deep basin. We don't think that's right anymore. Because here we have the intact geological boundary. These are the limestones that are here, and overlying them, the mudstones that we're interested in. So we think that there's a big time gap. There was erosion. The evidence for erosion is that we've got caves being formed in the limestone, and then there was a major sea level rise that brought water at the base of the Cambrian over this land surface. And it's in that recently flooded piece of continental shelf that we get the Cambrian explosion happening in Greenland. Put all that together, and we end up with a pattern something like this, that our fossiliferous interval are in these finest deposits in here. Pale to dark indicates coarse to fine. So these are muds, these are silts. We think that we've got a series of microbial mats that occasionally, after storm events, were buried by this coarser grained sediment that contained within it the swimming organisms and the burrowing organisms that have been ripped out of their burrows by the storm. So we're mixing two slightly different ecosystems together, actually, though we've no reason to believe that they live far apart. We don't think these storms are creating large distances of transport, just enough to disturb things and transport them. We're not seeing animals ripped apart by the transport, for example. We've done some geochemistry. It's tricky geochemistry, actually. And one of the things that we were particularly interested in was a particular ratio that's been much used for calculating oxygenation levels in sediments. And that's the ratio of highly reactive iron to the total amount of iron in the sediment. And the highly reactive iron is there in sulfides and in oxides. And it's that iron that is available for biological action by microbes or whatever. The remainder of the iron is locked up in minerals where biological organisms cannot extract that iron. The proportion of highly reactive iron as it increases is a sign that you're going into anoxia. And a ratio of about 0.38 is normally taken to indicate the point at which you have no oxygen in the ocean water at all. And from 0.2 to 0.38 is what we call dysoxia. You've got some oxygen, not enough for most organisms to survive, but not total anoxia. And you'll see that within our fossiliferous interval, for most of the time, the sediment was within that dysoxic layer. That's telling us that there was virtually no oxygen, virtually no modern organisms would be able to survive at those oxygen levels. But clearly, our Cambrian explosion ecosystem could. And that's a pattern that we've seen elsewhere around the world at other localities. So on the far right-hand side, we've got an estimated oxygen curve that wiggles around, but is by and large is less oxygen-rich than the surrounding sediment. What that's doing is two things. One, it's telling us that these microbial mat ecosystems were surviving on not much oxygen. That's important in our Cambrian explosion story. The second thing is that it's helping with the preservation, actually, because it reduces the number of things that could eat those organisms or degrade those organisms before they're preserved as fossils. Final few slides, let's pull it all together. So this is the seaside, this is the shore face, the beach of the Cambrian. Virtually no organisms present, except for some burrows that we know are present, probably indicating polychaete worms, but virtually nothing else could survive in this very shallow, high-energy water. It's only when we go out below the wave base, so obviously the ocean is constantly being churned, that's constantly stirring sediment up. So the sediment is very mobile above wave base. You only need to go paddling to know that. So this Cambrian explosion environment is not above wave base. Below that, we have what's called storm wave base, and that's the depth to which storms penetrate. Obviously, storms create bigger waves, so they penetrate to a deeper depth. Our locality seems to be just underneath storm wave base, with occasional sediment flows bringing in those additional fossils. We've got evidence in the sediments. We get these little coarse-grained packets, which are evidence of abrupt sediment flows coming in from slightly further up the shelf. So our locality is in low energy water. So what's controlling the Cambrian explosion at that point? What is the principal chemical or physical control on where our organisms were living? We know they were being transported in, but they're in relatively deep water from where you might intuitively expect. Because if you were going to rely on oxygen, and that oxygen was the primary control on the Cambrian explosion, as some people have suggested, you might expect our Cambrian explosion fauna to be here, where the water's being constantly churned up and oxygen is being added from the atmosphere. But it's not there. They're where oxygen is beginning to really decrease, down below storm wave base. And we know from the geochemical evidence that that water was dysoxic. There was virtually no oxygen getting to it from the surface of the ocean. So it doesn't seem that oxygen can have been a primary control on the Cambrian explosion, as many people have said. What about nutrient supply? Well, the nutrient supply by primary producers is happening in the photic zone, and preferentially in the top few meters of the photic zone. So once you go below the top few meters of ocean, the spectrum of light that's penetrating to that depth is very reduced. So most photosynthesis in modern oceans occurs in the top few tens of centimeters. That sediment, those nutrients are then recirculated. But again, if nutrient supply was the primary control of the Cambrian explosion, you'd expect the organisms to be up here as well. And actually, that evidence from the burrowing invading the carcasses whenever an organism died suggests that we're in a very nutrient-poor environment. So we've got good independent evidence that these organisms are living without much oxygen and they're living without much nutrients. There's one other thing that occurs to me that might be controlling the position of these organisms, and that's substrate mobility. What does that mean? How much is the sediment moving around? We know that burrowing has only just evolved, that these things are probably not very strong burrowers, they're not going very deep by modern standards. Perhaps they simply couldn't cope, for the most part, with sediment being moved around. They were too sensitive to environmental perturbation, to environmental stirring up. A lesson for our times, if ever there was one. So actually, that would be the perfect place to explain our ecosystem. They're sitting below the level to which storms penetrate. They're sitting below the level to which waves normally penetrate. And they're making the most. It's a make-do of oxygen and nutrient supply. But it seems to be the substrate mobility that's really controlling them. We can put all of those different things I've said together. And this is a paper that I published in Science a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, time flies, in which we tried to explain things as it not being a single hypothesis, but a whole chain. And what we think is that sea level rise flooded the continents. We've seen evidence for that at Sirius Passet. And there was a large amount of continental detritus. You know, imagine the flat ground around the city here being flooded by the sea. There's an awful lot of surface area of mineral for the sea to react with and transport those nutrients into the ocean. The chemicals that we talked about are phosphate. That's a nutrient. If you put phosphate in a pond, you will get a spike of production because most biological productivity is limited by a lack of phosphate. So that in itself provides a nutrient pulse. And then there's calcium that we've talked about as a cell toxin. Cell toxicity might have led to the origin of biomineralization and caused an explosion in animal diversity. Similarly, the increase in nutrient flux might have increased animal biodiversity. The origin of plankton feeding from some genomic alterations, some genomic novelties, gave rise to the origin of plankton, increasing habitable volume, as we mentioned, and all of these things circle around and amplify the overall effect. So our case would be that there isn't one cause of the Cambrian explosion. It's a whole chain of feedback loops, and that the geologists are right, the geochemists are right, and the biologists are right. It's all of those things, and these are color-coded in the same way as those initial slides. And we need to start thinking about the Cambrian explosion as a wholesale turnover in the way that the ocean system was working. And that's why I called the lecture the coevolution of life on Earth. It's a very intimate, holistic interaction that gave rise to us and all the other animals that are on the planet with us. Thanks very much.